Hey everybody, what's up? I'm DJ Sixsmith. Welcome to Sit Down. Today we're talking to Bill Madden. He's got his brand new book, Tom Seaver, A Terrific Life, one of the best baseball players ever. Bill, nice to meet you. How are you?
Good to see you.
So Tom Seaver, we lost him this year. 2020 has sucked for so many different reasons, but losing him was obviously such a big blow for the baseball world. You write the whole book about him and his story. So what was it like putting the book out at this time, given everything that happened?
Well, actually, the book was originally supposed to come out next April and for the start of the baseball season. That's when traditionally baseball books come out. But obviously, when he passed away in August, I had gotten the manuscript in a couple of months ahead of schedule. That was the good part. So it was there, and Simon and Schuster made the decision to move the pub date up from April to November the 24th to take advantage of the Christmas holidays. And so basically, that's what we did.
So when you think about his story, why don't we, go back to the early days in Fresno? What stands out about a young Tom Seaver before we knew him across the country and across the world?
Well, that was actually one of my favorite chapters in the book because I knew pretty much everything about Seaver and his career and his post-career, but what I didn't really have a whole lot of knowledge about was his formative years in Fresno. And it was a very interesting chapter in the fact that there was so much stuff that people never knew about him. Specifically, in Little League and in high school, he was the smallest guy on his team. He was a pretty good pitcher, but he didn't have any overwhelming fastball or anything because of his size. And it was something that was very concerning to him. He couldn't understand why he wasn't growing the way all his teammates were. He'd come from a family of athletes. His two sisters were athletes, older sisters, and his older brother was a swimmer at the University of California, and his father was a world-class amateur golfer. And they were all, around 6 feet. And Tom was kind of the runt of the family. And so when he got to his senior year and he saw some of his friends getting scholarships, he said to his parents, he said, "Look, I am not going to go to college on your dime. If I can't get into college on my own athletic ability, then I'm just going to have to figure out something else to do." And so he graduated from Fresno High. And that summer, he was trying to figure out something else to do. He went to work for his father's raisin company in Fresno, a job he hated. And then he realized he knew that his brother had been in the Marines, and he thought that that would be a good place for him to try to start a new life or whatever. So he enrolled in the Marine Reserves, and he went down to 99 Palms, California, with a friend of his who was also not going to college. And the two of them went down there, and Seaver went into Marine Corps Reserves at 5'9", 160. He came out of there 6 months later at 6'1", 210.
Wow.
This is what I call miracle grow. And all of a sudden, now we had the Tom Seaver that we all came to enjoy and respect and become a Hall of Fame pitcher. Because now, not only was he 6'1", 210, he also had a fastball now. And Tom always had a plan for everything, whether it was post-career when his plan was to go into the wine business, or all the way back in high school when his plan was to go to USC. He wanted to pitch for Rod Dato, the legendary coach at Southern California. But he knew to get there, he had to prove to Dato that he was not only, 6'1", 210 now, but he also could pitch against college competition. So his plan was to go to the Fresno City Junior College for 1 year and pitch against college caliber players. And then from there, hopefully Dato would recognize him and scout him and whatever and give him a scholarship. So he had a good year there, and Dato did, in fact, tell him, "I'm holding a scholarship for you, but before I give it to you, I want you to go to Alaska." Seaver said, "Alaska? Why do I have to go to Alaska?" And Dato says to him, "Trust me, kid, you're going to love it up there." And he sent him up to a team called the Alaska Gold Panners. And this was a summer wooden bat league, and against the top competition, mostly college players from all over the country, but mostly from a lot of them were from West Coast college players. And he was up there with Rick Monday and Greg Nettles and Bill Lee. I mean, these are guys that all went on to the major leagues. And so he went up there and he did very well there. And Dato finally, at the end of the summer, Dato said, okay, kid, I'm impressed. And so he got the scholarship and he went to USC.
That's really an incredible story. And I talked to Tom House a couple months ago who played with Seaver at USC, and he just said like he was blown away when Tom really started to come into his body. So when do you feel like Seaver thought that, okay, I'm good enough to be at USC, but I can also be a major league pitcher now?
Well, that was also a plan of his. In fact, he talked about it with Nancy, his future wife, when he met her, really got to know her at Fresno City College, junior college, and they would go on long walks at night, and she was very impressed with him because not only was he a jock, but he was also a very intelligent guy and very worldly. He was up on all the world events and things like that, and she had never met anybody like this. And one of the things he told her was, my ambition is to become a professional baseball player, a major league baseball player. So that was always in his mind and part of the plan. And of course, going to USC and pitching for Rod Dato, that's where you're going to get the most recognition you could possibly want in college, because Dato, I don't know how many players he sent to the major leagues, but it was 30 or 40 at least. And he did have a good year at USC, and he got drafted by first the Dodgers and then the Atlanta Braves.
So he had this whole winding path to get to the major leagues, and then eventually he winds up with the New York Mets, who at the time, Bill, were pretty much the laughing stock of Major League Baseball. So just paint the picture for the audience when Seaver arrives in New York and what the Mets franchise was looking like at that point.
Yeah, well, what happened was he was drafted by the Braves, only he had pitched a couple of games for USC that spring, and he thought they were exhibition games, but it turned out they were part of the regular schedule. And so one other team in baseball, we think it was probably the Dodgers because they had lost out on him the first time, blew the whistle and said that this is an illegal signing because Seaver was still college eligible at the time of the Braves giving him the bonus. He got a $4,000 bonus, $40,000 bonus, I should say. And then, so what happened was the commissioner of baseball had to come up with a solution to this problem because Seaver couldn't go back to college either. And he came up with this idea that he would offer Seaver's services to anybody who wanted to match the Braves offer. Any team that wanted to match the Braves bonus could submit a bid for him, and they would put the team's bids into a hat and draw the winning team out of a hat. And so only 3 teams wanted to bid for him, and it was the Phillies, the Indians, and the Mets. And so they drew out of the hat, and the Mets were the winning team. And Seaver tells the story, he was at home with his parents when the lottery was going on in New York at the commissioner's office. And when they told him that the Mets had drawn him, his mother shrieked, "Oh my God, not the Mets!" Because at the time, the Mets were the laughing stock of baseball. They had never had a winning season. This was 1966 now. And they'd had 4 straight awful last place losing seasons. But Seaver looked at it as a great opportunity for him because he figured the Mets, he had a much better chance of getting to the major leagues sooner than if he'd gone with, if he turned out to be Cleveland or the Phillies. And that's what happened. He only spent 1 year at AAA Jacksonville, and he was in the major leagues in 1967. And when he arrived on the scene in Shea Stadium and with his new team, he was really surprised at such a negative culture that had developed there. It all started with Casey Stengel as the Mets' original manager in 1962, with all these funny quotes about how bad his team was. Can't anybody here play this game? And it kept going on for the following year. And the writers, of course, all loved this. They cultivated Casey because he was such a great quote. And then he was succeeded by Wes Westrom, who was a dullard, to say the least. But the writers continued to write about Casey and the lovable losers. And Seaver walks into this atmosphere and he said, "I don't understand what's going on here." He said, "All I know is this." He says, "These writers keep talking about the amazings when they're talking about amazingly bad teams." And he said, "I can't relate to this." He says, "I've been a winner all my life, and I am not going to start now with losing teams. I'm just not going to. I just can't relate to this. And so his other teammates around the team, he made this plain in the clubhouse. He said it a number of times. He said, I had nothing to do with Marv Throneberry and Rod Keneal and those awful Mets teams, and I'm not going to start now. And all of a sudden, this brash rookie is starting to develop his own culture in that clubhouse. And 2 years later, of course, they were in the World Series.
I mean, it's crazy to be talking about that and then turn it into a World Series 2 years later. So when you think about the Miracle Mets in '69, and specifically Seaver's role in there, what is the craziest part of that story to you?
As far as getting to the World Series in 2
Yeah,
years?
as far as getting there, winning the thing, I mean, it was just
Well,
such a shock in so many ways.
yeah, well, it was. I mean, nobody certainly expected. The Mets had never had a winning season. They had another losing season in '68 when Gil Hodges took over as the manager. So there was no hint that this miracle was in the offing in '69, and they actually got off to a slow start in '69. But then suddenly things started. They started winning, and they started believing in themselves. And of course, Seaver believed in them all along. And when he made those statements in '67, his rookie year, he also followed it up by winning the Rookie of the Year award that year. I mean, he lived up to his words as far as him personally. And this was a pitching rich team. There's one thing that everybody noticed about the Mets in spring training in '69, that they had all of these great arms. Seaver, of course, was number one, but they had Jerry Koosman, they had Gary Gentry, they had Jim McAndrew. These were all young kids with, mid-90s fastballs, with the exception of Koosman. He was a finesse artist. But that was one thing you could see about this Mets team, that they were going to be a lot better than they had been because of the pitching. And that's what exactly happened. The one thing they needed, and Seaver always said this, it seemed like it was the story of his life with the Mets or later on with other teams, that he never had the offensive support that he wished he could have had, that could have made him even a bigger winner in the major leagues. In mid-season, though, they finally got a big bat when they acquired Don Clendenin to play first base. And Seaver said in the book, he talked to me about it a lot. He said that was the biggest thing about that year when we got Don Clendenin. All of a sudden now we had a big bat in the middle of the lineup. We never had that before.
That certainly helped. And you mentioned the fact that Tom Seaver was somebody who always had a plan. So was it his plan to play with the Mets his entire career? Did he have thoughts about playing for other teams? I mean, how did things kind of end with the Mets and then eventually move on to some of the different chapters there?
Well, he never wanted to leave the Mets, that's for sure. And he had a loyalty to the organization. Unfortunately, the organization didn't have that same loyalty to him. And in 1976, when free agency came into play in baseball, Seaver was already involved. He had already had a 2-year contract with the Mets. So he could not take immediate advantage of free agency, but he did make it clear to the Mets management that he didn't want to leave the Mets. But then in 1977, after the '76 season, all these pitchers, most of them inferior to him, were getting these huge contracts, so much more than he was making. And so Seaver thought it was only right if the Mets could at least tweak his contract or get him up to close to a par of what these other pitchers were getting. Well, M. Donald Grant, the chairman of the team, wanted nothing to do with renegotiating Seaver's contract. And he made it plain to him, we're not going to do that. We don't renegotiate contracts here. At the same time, Grant wanted nothing to do with free agency either. And Seaver was blasting him in the papers for not going after any of the free agents and not trying to improve the team. So all of this was going on in the summer of '77, the Seaver-Grant wars, as we call them. And then Grant enlisted the services of Dick Young, who was the columnist of the Daily News at the time, very powerful columnist, my former boss and mentor, I might say. I wasn't there at the time. I didn't join the Daily News until the following year. But anyway, so Young writes a series of columns ripping Seaver, saying he was an ingrate, greedy, a cancer on the team, doing Grant's business for him. And it looked like Seaver was going to leave because Grant was not budging on the contract renegotiation. And he finally said, he's trying to get traded. I'm going to accommodate it. I'm going to trade him. At that point, Seaver went over Grant's head and got himself a new contract with Mrs. DeRelay, who was the daughter of Joan Payson, the original Mets owner. And it looked like everything was settled until Young wrote one more column. And in the book, I say it was the 33 words that effectively drove Tom Seaver out of town. And those 33 words were, quote, Nolan Ryan is getting more than Seaver. And that galls Tom because Nancy Seaver and Ruth Ryan are very friendly. And Tom Seaver has long treated Nolan Ryan like a little brother. Seaver was at the pool when the Mets were staying in Atlanta. This is the day of the trading deadline, June 15th. Somebody showed him Young's column and showed him that paragraph. He got up from his chair at the pool, went into his room at the hotel there, called up Joe McDonald, the Mets general manager in New York, and screamed over the phone, "Get me the hell out of here. Wow. This is the last straw. He's brought my family into it now, and I will not tolerate this. I want out." And so that night they traded him to the Reds for 4 other players, and they also traded Dave Kingman, who was also involved in a contract dispute with Grant. And he was there at the time, their all-time leading home run hitter. And they called it the Midnight Massacre. It was the darkest day in Mets history.
It was such a rough day, and it's crazy that it came down to 33 words and the power of the newspaper at that point too. And it was so hard for Mets fans to watch him in Cincinnati and Chicago and some of these other stops. But for Seaver personally, what was it like for him to play in other cities? Because he did have success there. He did win 300 games. He did have a no-hitter. So what was it like for him once he did leave the Mets?
Well, they did him a favor in that respect. They traded him to the Reds, who were just coming off 2 straight world championships, the Big Red Machine team of Johnny Bench and Pete Rose and Joe Morgan, Tony Perez, Dave Concepcion. It was a great team he went to. Unfortunately, they were starting their decline at that point, but still, it was a good team, and Seaver did very well in Cincinnati in the 5 years he was there. And then, of course, the Mets reacquired him 5 years later, and he came back to New York, and he joined a very bad Mets team at the time and had a so-so year. And then, lo and behold, the Mets managed to blow it again after the 82 season. Actually, after the 83 season, I should say. There was this thing called the free agent compensation pool that baseball had set up to compensate teams that had lost type A or premium free agents to other teams. And the way it worked was every team in baseball could protect 15 players out of the entire organization. The rest of the players would go into a pool where the teams losing the free agent could select a player out of that pool. The White Sox had the first choice that year. And so what happened was I was sitting in my office at the Daily News when I got a call from a friend of mine who worked in the commissioner's office. And he asked me if I was going to be writing anything about the free agent compensation draft the next day. And I said, I don't know, I might write something about it, but neither New York team has lost a free agent, so it's not going to be a New York story. And he says, I don't know about that, Bill. I think it's going to be a very big New York story. I said, why? He says, you're not going to believe this, but the Mets have left Seaver unprotected on their list. I said, you're kidding me. I said, how do you know that? He says, because I'm looking at it right here. And he says, not only that, but I called the White Sox and they're going to draft him tomorrow. They're going to take him. They couldn't believe he was left unprotected. So now I'm armed with what became probably the biggest story I ever broke for the Daily News, but I had to get a confirmation. I called Frank Cashin, the general manager, and he confirmed the story to me very reluctantly, I might add. But he said, he's a 39-year-old pitcher. We didn't think anybody would draft him. And I said, well, Frank, I hate to tell you, but I think the White Sox are going to take him tomorrow. So now I have this story, and obviously this could never happen today in the age of Twitter and social media and everything else. But I'm sitting on this story, and we decided we were going to hold it to the last edition that night. And at the same time, I felt I owed an obligation to Seaver to not blindside him with this terrible news the next day, because this was a traumatic event in this man's life. He never wanted to leave the Mets again. So I called him at home to tell him what had happened, and the Mets had left him unprotected. And from that day on, he was very appreciative of the fact that I took the courtesy to call him and tell him about what I was going to be writing. And I think from that day on, he looked at me as someone other than just another writer, because we became very good friends from that day on. And who we would talk on the phone frequently during the seasons or whatever. And of course, it was another awful day in Mets history when the White Sox, in fact, took him. And of course, he goes to the White Sox. He had two pretty good years. He may have been a 39-year-old pitcher, but he won 15 games in both those 2 years with the White Sox, including the most important one, his 300th win against the Yankees in 1985 at Yankee Stadium.
And Carlton Fisk was his catcher for that game too.
Yeah, I mean, he had two Hall of Fame catchers. He had Johnny Bench in Cincinnati, and he had Carlton Fisk in Chicago, and they were both became two of his closest friends in life. So, and that 300th win at Yankee Stadium is the whole first chapter is about his 300th win. When I was writing this chapter, I felt like I was writing about a heavyweight fight, because that's about what it was. Seaver had so many obstacles he was fighting that day. The first one being it was Phil Rizzuto Day at Yankee Stadium, and he had to wait almost 2.5 hours for the Rizzuto festivities to get over with. Every corporate CEO in America was giving Rizzuto a gift of whatever. And Seaver's down in the bullpen warming up. And Tony La Russa said to me for the book, he said, I can't tell you how nervous I was that day. I felt it was so unfair to Tom that he had to endure this whole Phil Rizzuto Day and the pressure of pitching in Yankee Stadium. Why couldn't he have this game somewhere, anywhere else but New York and Yankee Stadium? And he says, I was really afraid we weren't going to play well behind him. And it was just a terrible feeling I had in my stomach. Well, Seaver pitched a very good game. And what he told me later on many times, the most proudest part of his 300th win was the fact that it was a complete game, because he prided himself in finishing what he started. I think he had 231 complete games in his career.
Wow.
And he's sixth on the all-time shutout list. And anyway, so there was a couple of times during the game when he got in a little bit of trouble, and Dave Duncan, the pitching coach, had to come out to talk to him. La Russa had gotten thrown out of the game early on, so Duncan was the acting manager. And the second time Duncan came out, there was runners on first and third, and Dave Winfield was coming up to bat, and there were two outs. And it looked like, Seaver looked like he might be really tiring at this point. But Fisk joins Duncan at the mound, and Fisk says to Duncan, he says, you're not seriously going to take him out of this game, right? You don't really think you're going to do that? And Duncan says, no, I just want to know how he feels. And Seaver says, I feel okay, Duncan. Fisk gets right in Seaver's face, and he says, you are not coming out of this game. Do you understand me? I will not let you come out of this. This is your day. This is your game, and you're going to finish it. And Seaver says, okay. And so he winds up striking out Winfield on a changeup, a 3-2 changeup to get out of the inning. And from that point on, he finished the game. They won 4-1, his uniform number, as which Nancy said later, hello. How about that for karma? And then the most amazing thing about this game, and when I wrote this book, I felt like I'm writing about ancient history here for readers who were reading this, who never saw Seaver pitch and never saw the way the game was then. He threw 143 pitches in that game.
Wow.
He's 39 years old.
Unbelievable. It's crazy. And it was just the perfect exclamation point to an amazing career. And Bill, I really appreciate the time, really appreciate the stories. Looking forward to checking this one out. Thanks so much. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you down the road, all right?
Okay, thank you.